We're dealing tonight with a rather sober theme. When you focus too much on the wrong side of issues, you may end up thinking that's all there is to it. But that's not true. However, what I'm going to say to you tonight is of enormous significance, especially in the western part of the world. When you look at the flow of history over the last 600 to 700 years, Western culture somewhere has lost its way. It has lost its moorings, its philosophical basis for how it even believed and why these cultures came into being. Russell Kirk, the noted American historian, wrote a very profound book called The Roots of American Order. Russell Kirk, as a philosopher of history, is really giving us a description of what framed America's idea of order. Why did Americans end up thinking the way they did? And he traces American roots back to 4 cities, to Jerusalem, to Athens, to Rome, and to London. He says Jerusalem gave this culture its moral categories, Athens gave this culture its philosophical categories, Rome gave this culture its legal categories, and England, of course, the immediate cultural progenitor that gave birth to this nation. And as he deals with that book, interestingly enough, this historian says, it appears now in this 20th century that we still remember Rome, we still remember Athens, we still remember London, but we've forgotten Jerusalem. That the moral framework which somehow was put into place because of a Judeo-Christian worldview. Now, I'm not by that implying, therefore, that the doctrine of Christianity was woven into the fabric of the culture, but some of the fundamental assumptions of that worldview were taken into the formative ethos of this culture. I've said it many, many times, without apology. Islam would never have given birth to America. Pantheism would never have given birth to America. When I say pantheism, I'm talking about religions like Jainism or Hinduism or Buddhism. And as I look at the landscape now and look at what's happened in Europe and the tragedy there, look at what happened in Amsterdam with the killing of Van Gogh's descendant by some radical again from one of those faiths that believed in dealing with his faith, you attack his sacred belief, so your answer is kill the man. And now the Netherlands is waking up saying, have we gone too far? Have we lost our own culture in all of this? Now, this is therefore not meant to be adversarial as a talk, but it is important that we understand that at the heart of every culture is a religion or a religious worldview. So when you look back upon the last 6 centuries, starting from the Renaissance in the 12th and 13th centuries, all the way to the 20th century, you saw the human worldview sort of moving from one side to another, till finally we arrived at the 20th century, the postmodern world, where we end up saying that words mean nothing, absolutes mean nothing, morality means nothing, you are the definer of your own reality. We talk about manufacturing reality by language, that we choose to give meaning to words. Words don't have meaning in and of themselves. We choose to define morality. There is no such thing as a moral framework outside of us. But somewhere in the last 100 years, there was a very significant character on the philosophical landscape. And ironically, he was the son of a pastor, and both of his grandfathers were pastors as well. I'm talking about the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And when Nietzsche began to do his writings, he was brilliant in the sense that he took philosophy away from its boredom and its multisyllabic ideas and so on, and brought it down into day-to-day living so that people realized there was even an enchantment to philosophy. When you read his books and you read his writings, you begin to see the parables of Thus Spake Zarathustra and all. He may well have been the bridge between academic philosophy and artistic philosophy. Because today, many young people may say they're not interested in philosophy, but their songs philosophize, their movies philosophize, So they are coming up with a philosophy that is not born by studying long treatises on ideas, but they are philosophizing in the sense they want to tell you what life is all about. It was the noted 18th century Scottish political activist Andrew Fletcher who said, "Let me write the songs of a nation. I don't care who writes its laws." But when you listen to Nietzsche here, you'll begin to see how he provided a bridge between the 19th and the 20th century. He was born in 1844, died in 1900. He spent the last 13 to 14 years of his life almost insane. And ironically, when he was in that stupor of insanity, his mother sat by his bed for long hours because as a little boy, she'd be teaching him verses of scripture. And now, after he'd done his penmanship and popularized the phrase, "God is dead," he would go into fits of silence, as it were, day after day after day, and then suddenly would scream out something and it would be a verse of scripture. But the last 13 years of his life he spent insane. Listen to what he says in one of his parables called The Madman. "Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, 'I'm looking for God, I'm looking for God.' As many of those who did not believe in God were standing together there, he excited considerable laughter. 'Have you lost him then?' said one. 'Did he lose his way like a child?' said another. 'Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Maybe he's gone on a voyage or emigrated.' So they shouted and laughed him to scorn. But the madman sprang into their midst and pierced them with his glances. 'Where is God gone?' he cried. 'I'll tell you where he's gone. We've killed him. You and I, we are all his murderers. But now, how have we done this? How were we able,' now please notice the metaphors he uses, 'how were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us a sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns, maybe? Are we not perpetually falling backwards, forwards, sidewards, and in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not suddenly become colder? Is not more and more night coming on us all the time? Must not lanterns have to be lit in the morning hours? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything yet of God's decomposition? God's decomposed too, you know, and he is dead. He remains dead, and we have killed him. Now, how shall we, the murderer of all murderers, compose ourselves? Because that which was holiest and mightiest of all that the world ever possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood from us? With what water can we purify ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games will we need to invent? Is this not the greatest deed too great for us? Must not we ourselves now have to become God, simply to seem worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, you know, and whoever is born after us for the sake of this deed will be part of a higher history than all history hitherto." Here the madman fell silent and again regarded his listeners. They too were silent and they stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern to the ground and it broke and went out. "I come too early, maybe. My time has not yet come." It has been related further that on the same day that the madman entered divers churches and there sang a requiem aeternam Deo, let out and quieted, he said to have retorted each time, "What are these churches now, if they are not the tombs and sepulchres of a dead God? God is dead. We have killed him." Immanuel Kant, ironically, was a churchman. But Immanuel Kant said this, that metaphysical propositions of moral order, and ultimately about the eternal being of God and all, really fall into the category of nonsense. You cannot make meaningful statements about such categories. And it led ultimately to a skepticism. He believed rationally we were going to be able to come up with what is right and wrong, even though he himself smuggled in this comment that the starry hosts above and the moral law within always keeps me in awe. But as skepticism took its toll and positivism began to be introduced, where the scientific worldview was the only worldview that could be rationally tested and defended, pronouncements about moral order and about God and so on were thrown into the waste bin. And now we stand 100 years after Nietzsche, and the time has come. We now live with that prognostication that there is no God. You cannot make any meaningful statement about God anymore. I remember lecturing at the Geopolitical Institute in Moscow, Russia in somewhere in the early 1990s it was. That lecture was at the Lenin Military Academy, filled with Russian officers. And throughout the talk there was a hostility so visible, one of them kept giving me this kind of a sign. We were going on for about an hour, and this guy just kept going like this the whole time. As soon as I finished, he stood up and he yelled out at me. He said, "You've used the word God. What are you talking about?" And it dawned on me that Joseph Stalin, who'd made the comment that under his rulership he was going to eradicate the notion of God, had succeeded. You know, when a person says God is a meaningless term, and I'm an atheist, they are saying I do not believe in God, but they've just finished telling you it's a meaningless term. So what are they denying? Must not one have to posit some kind of a content to the word before they say this is exactly what we are denying? Otherwise you're denying a meaningless term. That's basically a redundancy. It's like saying nonsense is nonsense. Of course it is nonsense. Say, I deny the existence of God, and God is a meaningless term. But when you look at this and begin to try to understand what the ramifications are, what the implications are, you know, atheists live under this illusion that if you deny God, then there's a monolithic way of thinking about reality. It's completely false. I have made a list of 7 types of humanism which have a different starting point. Evolutionary humanism of Julian Huxley, behavioral humanism of B.F. Skinner, existentialist humanism of Jean-Paul Sartre, pragmatic humanism of Dewey, Marxist humanism of Marx and Feuerbach. You've got the egocentric humanism of Ayn Rand and the cultural humanism of Carlos Lamont and so on. They have different starting points for morality. It does not give you some kind of a monolithic answer. So God has been denied. Now we are all on an equal playing field. The egotistic humanism of Ayn Rand is very different to the humanism of B.F. Skinner, where love is the only thing that counts, or the ego is the only thing that counts. So what I want to present to you, ladies and gentlemen, tonight, as best as I can, is what happens when you evict God and the foundations begin to crumble within a given culture. The first thing that happens is you begin to realize that there is no more a basis for a moral law, and yet you end up making moral pronouncements all the time. Isn't it interesting? We taught the students at our Ivy League schools that morality was relative. And then when they went to Wall Street and started living with their moral relativism, we put them behind bars. That's the way it works. We cannot simply live in the comfort zone of knocking morality out. And you know what? There's a very well-known English journalist by the name of Steve Turner, who looked at the dawn of this naturalistic worldview and secularistic worldview and talked about where are we heading now. So he took Nietzsche, who was satirical in his own way, and he put it into poetic form and told us how deadly this satirical end really was. Listen to the half humor and half caution that he gives us. He says, we believe in Marx, Freud, and Darwin. We believe everything is okay as long as you don't hurt anyone to the best of your definition of hurt and to the best of your definition of knowledge. We believe in sex before, during, and after marriage. We believe in the therapy of sin. We believe that adultery is fun. We believe that taboos are taboo. We believe that everything's getting better, despite evidence to the contrary. The evidence must be investigated, and you can prove anything with evidence. We believe there is something in horoscopes, UFOs, and bent spoons. Jesus was a good man, just like Buddha, Muhammad, and ourselves. He was a good moral teacher, although we think some of his good morals were really bad. We believe that all religions are basically the same. At least the ones that we read were. They all believe in love and goodness. They only differ on matters of creation, sin, heaven, hell, God, and salvation. We believe that after death comes the nothing, because when you ask the dead what happens, they say nothing. If death is not the end, and if the dead have lied, then it's compulsory heaven for all, excepting perhaps Hitler, Stalin, and Genghis Khan. We believe in Masters and Johnson. What's selected is average, what's average is normal, what's normal is good. We believe in total disarmament. We believe there are direct links between warfare and bloodshed. Americans should beat their guns into tractors, and the Russians would be sure to follow. We believe that man is essentially good. It's only his behavior that lets him down. This is the fault of society. Society is the fault of conditions. Conditions are the fault of society. We believe that each man must find the truth that is right for him, and reality will adapt accordingly. The universe will readjust. History will alter. We believe that there is no absolute truth, accepting the truth that there is no absolute truth. We believe in the rejection of creeds and the flowering of individual thought. And then he puts this postscript. If chance be the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, sniper kills 10, youths go looting, bomb blast school, it's but the sound of man worshipping his maker. You hear that? If chance be the father of all flesh, if you're here by accident, then disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, sniper kills 10, youths go looting, bomb blast school, it's but the sound of man worshipping his maker. Nietzsche told us this is exactly what would happen. He said 2 things would happen in the 20th century because God had died in the 19th century. He said, number 1, a universal madness would break out, and number 2, the 20th century would be the bloodiest century in history. And if you look at the 20th century, we killed more people than the previous 19 put together. This is what happens when you read and understand the ramifications of a world without God. Listen to these words. I almost indict myself when I read it because it bothers on the nauseating reality that men will sing about now. The Ghetto Boys, which sold their album Mind of a Lunatic, within hours millions were sold. One of the stanzas they sing, she begged me not to kill her, I gave her a rose, then slit her throat, watched her shake till her eyes closed, had sex with the corpse before I left her, and drew my name on the wall like helter-skelter. And that sells. That sells. And we want to know what happens when a society no longer has a point of reference. You know, Darwin also had the insight, and he said this in his The Descent of Man. He said, look, if what I have said to you is right in its scientific theory, then the metaphysical extrapolation is going to be unparalleled. And what he told us there was that the metaphysics of all of this is so deadly that if nature brought about such domination of the weaker by the stronger, he said, then we will see unprecedented violence in the future. So if you take his scientific theory of naturalistic evolution and extrapolate it into a philosophy of life, then you end up with this kind of violence. Nietzsche said it, and listen to it now. Think if I made this comment today on a television program. Listen to this, what Nietzsche says. Equality is a lie concocted by inferior people who arrange themselves in herds to overpower those who are naturally superior to them. The morality of equal rights is a herd morality, and therefore it opposes the cultivation of superior individual. It leads to the corruption of the human species. The real truth about objective truth is that the latter is a fiction. Every candidate for truth must first be expressed in language, and language is notoriously unable to get us to reality. Words like a hall of mirrors reflect only each other, and in the end point back to the condition of their users without having established anything about the way things really are. Truth is the name we give to that which agrees with our instinctive preferences. It is what we call our interpretation of the world, especially when we want to foist it upon others. But then listen to what he said. I am still too pious that even I worship at the altar where God's name is truth. What he's really saying is, If I don't believe in truth, I'm headed in that direction. And he told us equality is a lie. It is a concoction by the weak humanity that forms itself in herds to overcome the superior. Adolf Hitler took that as his philosophical basis for his grand experiment in the Third Reich. That's why Viktor Frankl said that all that took place in Auschwitz and other concentration camps was not conceived by some defense ministry department, but was generated behind lecterns and platforms of professors and instructors and educators. He said it was the lecturers and the teachers that ended up generating the philosophy of extermination. That's what he reminded us. And so I say to you today, that when you remove God and wipe away his transcendent notion, and you take Jerusalem, as it were, out of our culture, and I'm using that metaphorically, for the moral law came via the Hebrew people centuries ago, which gave us the sacredness of life, the sacredness of word, the sacredness of property, the sacredness of sexuality, and on and on. And now we don't want it in our courts, we don't want it in our public buildings, we don't want it anywhere, we don't even want it in our coins. And what we are really saying is, we are defining our own reality, and like a hall of mirrors, we will end up defining ourselves. And you know what? We are naive enough in the West to think that's where we will end up. We won't. Nature abhors a vacuum. There are other worldviews from the eastern part of the world that will see this vacuum and storm in. Take my word for it. We will never have the moral power as a secularistic society with such implications to withstand the leverage that Eastern philosophies and religions give to themselves, which time has not been able to eradicate. Marxism never conquered India because India had its strong roots in its own Hindu worldview. And Islam continues to reign in those parts of the world. And now with the influx that comes in, because we have aborted in such huge numbers in this part of the world, we are actually importing worldviews at the same time. And obviously, in the right sense, pluralism has its place. What I'm only saying is this: you will not remain in a neutral position philosophically. It will not be that way. It has never been that way. All I'm saying to you is, without God, there is no moral law, and atheism's absolute denial of the absolute ends up with a relativism. The second thing is there is no source and no definition left for meaning. Meaning becomes a sort of a term that you really don't know where to find its explanation. I remember years ago speaking in the University of the Philippines, Manila. This was in the 1980s, in the early days of while I was starting to lecture on these subjects. And a student stood up at the back of the auditorium and he said to me, "Everything in this world is meaningless." I said, "You don't believe that?" He said, "I do." I said, "No, you don't." He said, "I do." I said, "I don't believe you don't." He said, "Who are you to tell me I don't?" "I do." I said, "Say it again." He said, "Everything in this world is meaningless." I said, "You don't believe that?" He said, "I do." I said, "Then remain standing. This shouldn't take more than a minute." I said, "I assume that you assume that what you just said was meaningful. Is that right?" If what you just said was meaningful, then everything is not meaningless. If everything is meaningless, what you've just said is meaningless too. In effect, you've said nothing. You can sit down. Do you know, at the end of that lecture, I was walking out of there and he was pacing the back of the auditorium, muttering to himself, "If everything is meaningless, then what I said is meaningless too." He came to a church service that night. And at the end of that church service, he was the first one face down at the altar. He found out that you cannot deny meaning in the absolute sense without assuming that the denial is meaningful. But here is the profound words of Stephen Jay Gould, the paleontologist. "We are here because one odd group of fishes had a peculiar fin anatomy." That in itself is so wonderful to start off with. That's why I'm here. "That could transform its sleigh into legs for terrestrial creatures, because comets struck the earth and wiped out dinosaurs, thereby giving mammals a chance not otherwise available. So thank your lucky stars in a literal sense. Okay, he goes on. Because the earth never froze entirely during an ice age. We're here because a small and tenuous species arising in Africa 250,000 years ago has managed so far to survive by hook and by crook. We may yearn for a higher answer, but none exists. This explanation, though superficially troubling, if not terrifying, is ultimately liberating and exhilarating. Doesn't that exhilarate you? That you're the random product of chance, a blip on the radar screen of time, an accidental entity which matter had no prevision of your coming into being. And then he says, ultimately exhilarating, we cannot read the meaning of life passively into the facts of nature. We must construct these answers ourselves from our own wisdom and ethical sense. There is no other way. Suppose one were to grant him even the microprocesses that he's talked about. Let's grant all of that terrain. Suppose one was to give all that ground up. How is it exhilarating to know that you are here by accident? Is that not sort of cheating on reality? If you're here by accident, I can also remove you by incident. Because I do not want you to stand in my way. The horror of this, the existentialists, funnily enough, fellows like Sartre and Camus, Heidegger and all of these boys were writing on meaninglessness, and some of their books were the fattest books being written. That life had no meaning. Is it any wonder that a man like Jean-Paul Sartre on his deathbed says, my philosophy was unlivable. My philosophy was unlivable. Let me ask you this. Have you ever held your little boy or your little girl in your arms and looked at them as a random collocation of atoms? Is that the way you think about your children or your spouse or your parents or your neighbor? That somebody has come into being because of some quirk in some distant past, some primordial slime that began to engineer its own destiny? Is that encouraging to you? How can this be? Are they cheating me? Are they lying to me? Do they really believe this is exhilarating? They don't believe it. Neither can they live by it. And that's why they keep attacking and attacking and attacking. They may believe that there is no God, but they cannot believe that there is no meaning. They somehow smuggle in meaning and value. They smuggle in the value of the word, just like, Nietzsche saying words really don't have meanings. We give to them, well, if they don't have meaning, what is he trying to tell us? He assumed what he was telling us was meaningful. And you see this going on and on and on and on. And you know what? I have sat by people and I've asked them sometimes, why do you think life is meaningless? If they don't hang it on some metaphysics of origins, they will hang it on one particular issue, that there is too much of hate and too much of evil in this world, therefore there cannot be any meaning. And I respect that kind of a response. And I've dealt with it in some of my writings. That doesn't shock me. But here's what I want to shock you with. I want to tell you this. Ultimately, you don't end up without meaning because you're tired of pain. You end up with meaning when you're exhausted, pleasure, and find you're still not found it to bring you happiness and fulfillment. We had lunch with a couple of friends who are here tonight. And he was talking to our waitress at the table. And basically told the waitress who was serving us that he was giving her a gift. And he gave her a gift. And he said, I'm giving you this gift for just one reason. Because I want you to know that the most important thing in life is that you know Jesus Christ. He says, and I want you to know, I'm very successful. I have everything I've ever wanted, but nothing brings me the kind of fulfillment that Christ does. My wife and my colleagues and I were invited in Hong Kong to speak to a group of people called the Diamond Collar Group. And the man who hosted us was the 7th wealthiest man in the world. He and his brothers had just bought up a piece of property in Hong Kong and paid for it in cash, $6 billion US. I don't know how many zeros that means, but I do know it was a lot. And we're sitting around this table. We had a long journey. We've just arrived from the United States into Hong Kong, and he was hosting us for a big dinner. And I looked across the table. I said, Tom, you've invited me. I'm here as your guest to speak to your corporate executives and all of that. You become a Christian? He said, yes. I said, tell me how and when. He said, one day, 18 months ago, I was sitting at the top of my office building, and I phoned my wife, and I said to her, I have such emptiness within my heart. Everything I have has not brought me happiness. I'm a lonely man. Can we do something to find help? She said, Tom, I want you to know I'm as empty as you are. Can we go to church tonight somewhere? He said, okay. And she said, why don't we go to such and such a church? I don't know anything about it, but it is opposite one of the apartment buildings we own, so we won't have to pay for parking. So let's go there. And they go for that meeting on a Wednesday night. It began his journey into truth, to finding Jesus Christ into his life, who said he was the way, the truth, and the life. You see, what it is that God does in your life when he brings you meaning is he puts all of your proclivities together in its legitimate expression, that the brain can be used to its best. So if you are a philosopher, you can be a great philosopher even as you acknowledge God's gift of your mind. When he's given you the gift of arts, you can be a great artist even as God has given you the gift of the aesthetics and the arts and music. If you are a janitor maintaining a building, you do it with the excellence of maintaining that property, of presenting it to people who come the next morning so that you excel in what it is you're committed to do. And that's why I labor as hard as I do in my writing and my speaking and my lecturing, because before it's a presentation to you, it's an offering to God. That's what brings meaning in life. That is what it is that ultimately binds these dots together. You see, meaninglessness does not come from being weary of pain. Meaninglessness ultimately comes from being weary of pleasure. I believe it was Boris Becker who, after winning his second or third Wimbledon, was being interviewed, and they asked him what his biggest challenge was. And he said his biggest challenge was the fact that he still had to struggle to keep from committing suicide. He'd reached the top. Deion Sanders, who plays professional football, or is known in Atlanta as Neon Deion, and he played for the Atlanta Braves too, played baseball and football at one season, highly gifted. When he was being interviewed once as to what brought God into his life, he said, it happened the night I was playing for the Dallas Cowboys and we won the Super Bowl. I got back to my hotel room that night and felt more empty than I'd ever felt before. He ordered a Lamborghini that night on the phone. Thought, that'll be great. It wasn't. Here's what I want to say to you with all the sincerity of my heart. You may not agree with my philosophical position, but I ask you to consider this truth, that you will never find meaning to be meaningful until you find out the purpose for which you were created. And the purpose that Stephen Jay Gould talks about is not exhilarating, it is emptying you of meaning. What God talks about is to give you the grandest dignity when he tells you he's made you in the image of God. That is what brings meaning. But without God, there's no moral law. There is no meaning. Thirdly and quickly, there is no hope. Life is snuffed out at the end and you're gone, you're finished. Life is vanquished, as it were. It has been spent. And all that is left now is for the chemicals of the body to be buried into some decaying form. I remember in 1971, when I was in my mid-20s, an undergraduate student, and went to Vietnam. I don't know why I chose to go there, but I wanted to go to a troubled spot of the world where there was so much of strife. And through the invitation of somebody who made it possible and financed the whole thing, as a young man in my 20s, went into Vietnam. I started in Saigon, went through the length of the whole country all the way to Quang Tri at the northern end of the demilitarized zone. And I still remember sitting in that veranda at night looking at an amber-colored sky as the war was raging and the sound of shells and bombs and gunfire so close to where we were. And at night time watching my host take iron bars and put it across the doors, and every night was a prayer, where in effect we didn't know whether we'd see the light of day the next day. And as a young man, that was making a profound impact on me. I could only get around either by motorbike from village to village, or with the American boys who would take me in their helicopter gunships or their transport planes if they were going in that direction. And so I saw destruction and devastation so early in my life. But I remember in every one of those instances, when I finished speaking in a military base, whether it was US or Korean or the Viet Cong prisons or in military hospitals, every one of them wanted one thing: hope. One thing: hope. And sometimes I, as a younger man, would be talking to somebody far more sophisticated than me, sometimes in the chopper, sitting and talking. It was all about meaning, all about hope. What is going to happen if I were to find this to be my last day? And one of those Vietnamese soldiers, when he came to that struggling moment in his own life, wrote this poem. I think it's fascinatingly written. Lord God, I have never spoken to you, but now I want to say, how do you do? You see, God, they told me you didn't exist, and like a fool I believed all this. Last night from a shell hole I saw your sky. I figured right then they had told me a lie. Had I taken time to see the things you made, I'd have known they weren't calling a spade a spade. I wonder, God, if you'll take my hand. Somehow I feel that you'll understand. Funny I had to come to this hellish place before I had time to see your face. Well, I guess there isn't much more to say, but I'm sure glad, God, I met you today. I guess 0 hour will soon be here, but I'm not afraid since I know you're near. The signal, well, God, I'll have to go. I like you lots, I want you to know. Look now, this will be a horrible fight. Who knows, I may come to your house tonight. Though I wasn't friendly to you before, I wonder, God, if you'd wait at your door. Look, I'm crying, I'm shedding tears. I'll have to go now, God, goodbye. Strange now since I met you, I'm not afraid to die. Tell us that in the last week, the Ramstein military base is flooded with hundreds of our soldiers coming back wounded. I was there a few months ago, my colleague and my wife. I remember walking through from ward to ward and seeing our young men and women injured. Not one of them turned me down when I said, can I pray for you before I leave? Not one of them. Please, sir. Please, sir. Yes, sir. Please, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Reaching out, grabbing your hand. You see, life has to close in on you before you put it in perspective. And I'm saying to you is, even if you resist what I'm trying to present to you tonight, I think maybe it's far more spiritual than you'd ever envisioned. Life will close in, and you have to define its parameters. And if atheism is an absolute denial in an absolute sense of God, there is no life beyond the grave. And what you're really saying is what Jean-Paul Sartre ended up saying, the only philosophical question I cannot answer is why I don't commit suicide. There is the loneliness of the death experience, and nobody understands it better than a minister who has to go from bedside to bedside or from family to family, comforting them. When God was denied and removed, Nietzsche said much would happen. We have wiped away the horizon. We wiped away the line between good and evil. We wiped away the line between meaning and meaninglessness. We wiped away the line between hope and despair. And philosophers now are writing on despair. There is this whole idea of chaos theory, chaotic. And all I need to do is walk into a room where a newborn baby has just been delivered, and understand that that life is there with meaning. All I have to do is look at an altar and watch a beautiful bride walk up and pledge herself to her groom and say, I do, and watch the delight in their eyes and know there is meaning. All I know is when one's lying on his or her deathbed and says, look, I've followed God, I know Him completely, this is not a moment to despair. As Malcolm Muggeridge said in his senior years, he said, the worst news anybody can give me is that they have come up with some kind of medication that'll give me 15 more years. He said, I'm ready to go, ready to go. He had hope. No law, no meaning, no hope. And lastly, atheism puts all of its eggs into one basket. in such a determined way that if that atheist was wrong, he or she has still so committed himself or herself that there is no room for recovery after death. They've eliminated God. And that whole sense of banking on this faith position that there is no God, it's a faith position. It cannot be absolutely defended, because I'll tell you why. To even say there is no God in an absolute sense presupposes infinite knowledge. It's like me saying to you there's no such thing as a white stone with black dots anywhere in all of this universe. The only way I can say that is if I have comprehensive knowledge of this whole universe. So how can one say there is no God in an absolute sense unless he or she has infinite knowledge? And if they do have infinite knowledge, that's really what they're denying, that there's nobody in this world with infinite knowledge. So they end up positing an infinite being while denying that infinite beings actually exist. There is no way to rationally posit a moral absolute in the negative sense, or an absolute in the negative sense, without presupposing that you have all the information that there is to have on such a reality. This is what led Pascal to his conviction. And by the way, it is often misinterpreted as some kind of wager. It is not. Pascal was not some kind of a leap in the dark kind of a guy. He's not somehow saying, I think I've got the better end of two deals. At places he argues reasonably and rationally for the existence of God. But here's what he says. Should a man be in error in supposing the Christian religion to be true, he could not be a loser by mistake. But how irreparable is his loss and how inescapable is his danger, who should err in supposing it to be false? Here's what he's saying. If a man believes in God and is actually wrong, after he dies, he's really not a loser because he's no longer conscious to regret the way he lived. But if a man denies God and dies and finds out God actually does exist, there's an awful lot of remorse left for that individual. And he says, if you put me to the test about my life, I'm fulfilled. So by atheistic terms, if fulfillment is the only test, Pascal says, even as a believer in God, I meet that test. I'm totally fulfilled. So what is the problem? I'm totally fulfilled, and if I'm wrong, when I die, I don't regret it. You say you're totally fulfilled, and some of you may or may not be, but after you die, you find out there is a God, you do regret it. And so this airtight case for him said, I meet every test in living and even a test in death. And so he says, I want to put my trust in that which meets both tests. But without God, there is no law, no meaning, no hope. And if you're wrong, there will be no recovery. When you deny God, you're being unfaithful to your Creator. When you serve Him, you're being faithful to Him. Moral law, hope, meaning, and recovery is all countered in one simple commandment: to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul and all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Let me close with this illustration. Dennis Prager, the Jewish philosopher, was debating Jonathan Glover from Oxford University. Jonathan Glover was an atheist. And he was talking about all the horrors that religion has brought in this world and this and that, and the usual argument, think of all the millions religion has killed. Nobody ever tells you how many millions irreligion has killed, but that's a different subject. And on and on and on and on. And so Glover is waxing eloquent and Prager stops him at one point. He said, Professor Glover, you're my guest here in Los Angeles. I have a question for you. Suppose tonight you take your car and you're just sightseeing all alone, and you end up in a dreadful part of this city, and you're lost. And there are no lights on the road, and your car breaks down. And you get out of your car and open the hood, and you're trying to figure out what's wrong, and you're alone. 2 a.m, and you hear footsteps coming towards you. And you turn around and you see a half a dozen big, burly guys walking towards you. Would it or would it not make a difference to you if you found out they were just coming out of a Bible study? This is a Jewish philosopher asking a secular philosopher whether it make a difference if you're coming after studying this. Jonathan Glover ceded that point. He said it wouldn't make a difference. Why? What you believe in your heart ultimately is embodied in your life. And if you believe you're a creature of God and that your neighbor is one also fashioned by God, you will honor that person and life becomes more meaningfully spent. If you believe you're the random collocation of atoms, you may as well wipe that person out because they're going to be wiped out anyway. And that's the philosophy that some people choose to live by.